it's not wise to go and tell your story to anybody. You have to be careful and you have to learn what it is to be a safe person. You need to know what those traits are. Absolutely. So what I tell people is an untold story never heals. And so if you want to heal, there is a risk. You have to risk. And what I have found that is once you've told one, then the floodgates come and you begin to share your story, not only for your own sake, but for the sake of letting other people know that they're not alone.
Welcome to the Your Story Matters podcast with Branon Dempsey. Your Story Matters is dedicated to help survivors of abuse grow in their healing and recovery from trauma. While we may not be able to change our beginning, we do have the power to change the ending. We hope that you'll be inspired by today's message because you matter. Your healing matters because your story matters. Here's Branon.
This episode, we have for you Mary DeMuth, who is in RC, willing and able to share her story side of things of both spiritual abuse and sexual abuse. So we're excited to have you guys here to join us. And we ask that before you watch any further, that you do hit the subscribe button, follow our links, and we thank you again for joining us. So Mary, we're going to be talking to you this morning. How are you today?
I am good. I'm happy to be alive and just grateful for another day.
That's right. You know, you were so huge in recovery. You have your own story. It's so often that in the church, we become silent about our abuse because of so many fears. Either we're in our own recovery state or we haven't begun that yet. And there is the fear of being shamed. There is the imprisonment of our own emotions. And I couldn't think of a better person than you to speak about that, as you've really been through the gamut. And I feel like you and I have some connection there because there's similarities, but yet we want to know your story. So can you tell our audience who you are, what you're about, and what you're doing?
Yeah, so I'm Mary, and I have been in this space a really long time. I actually have been talking about especially sexual abuse since the 90s. And I would have these experiences where I would share openly and I would freak out all of the speaker coordinators. I could see them in the back like, no, but I didn't care. And that's awesome. A little bit of the rebel in me, because I would have all these people come up to me afterwards and say, thank you. I thought I was the only one. And so I feel like, because I've had a large measure of healing, my job is to go first so that other people cannot feel alone anymore. My own story is fairly complicated, but I was a childhood sexual abuse victim that continued throughout my life, actually. But the main thrust of that abuse was when I was 5 years old, and I had these babysitter. Well, I had a babysitter, but there was these boys that lived near the babysitter who were teenagers. And as a kindergartner, then they took me out every day. And they told me they'd kill my parents if I told. They used really bad language to describe what they were doing. And the interesting thing about my story is that I actually told, which is exceptionally rare. And I told my babysitter, who was the one that was pushing me out to be with these boys, which also tells you how unsafe my biological mother and biological father were. I didn't feel safe telling them, but I told the chain smoking babysitter who hated kids. And she said something that just ruined my heart and my soul for a long time. She said, I'll tell your mom. And so the next day, when I expected nothing to happen because the cat was out of the bag, they knocked on the door again. She put me out. She was an evil, evil human being. She put me out in the evergreen air again. I was in Seattle at the time, and it happened again and again. And I finally thought to myself, there's no human on this earth that will ever protect me. If my mom's not going to, of course, she didn't tell my mom, but I thought she did, because adults tell the truth. And so I was like, there's no one that's going to protect me. So I learned how to be very self-sufficient and protectionary. That's not a word, but I just made it up. And I learned how to sleep. And so if I pretended to sleep for hours on end, she couldn't be bothered to wake me up. So I quote unquote saved myself. And then we moved away from that situation after my kindergarten year. But I often felt like I had a come get me sign on my forehead, that I was constantly being preyed on. Thank God I was a runner. I ran away. I literally physically ran away from several attempts from different people in my life. And so then, of course, the end of that story is just all that trauma. And I also had a predatory father who was doing exceptionally inappropriate, horrible things to me as well. He passed away when I was 10, and I think it's part of God's severe mercy. I think it was just a good thing. So I was going to be next.
Oh my gosh. Yes, we have a huge connection there.
Wow. Okay. Well, how was that?
Because my father abused me and neglected me when I went through my sexual abuse. And he died in 2021. And I'm sorry to say this for those of you who are hearing it, it's not being from a cold heart, but I was relieved when he died. And I didn't feel sorry. And I went through my therapist time and time again, like, why do I not feel this way? I should feel sad. And he told me, you don't need to guilt yourself into something that you no longer need to own. And that stuck with me. And it's still hard today because I miss my dad and my kids ask about my dad. And it's hard for me to tell them. I can't tell them why, because it's not their pain to bear. You know? And I'm blessed that they don't have to live with the same pain that I do, but they just don't know. And that's okay. And at some point when they do read my book, they will know. But it's a scary thing. It's frightening to put yourself out there to your parents and to communicate, hey, this is what happened to me. That is so foreign for those of us abuse victims. And to run, you did. What went through your mind to motivate you to speak and to run?
So the running was more, it's interesting because, of course, during that first year of abuse, I was just freezing. That's a normal, common response. I couldn't do anything because they were so much bigger than me.
Right.
In the other instances, I put on the flee and the fawn pretty well. And in those instances, I was like either near my home or in a place where I could get away. And I was so terrified, although there was a moment in dating where I froze again. And thankfully I stiffened enough for the person to notice and they stopped doing what they're going to do. So yeah, I don't know that it's brave. I think we all have in different traumas, we have different responses. I know now as an adult, it's either freeze or fawn. Those are the two that I typically do. If I'm in a difficult relationship, I will absolutely fawn. I will do everything I can to make them like me again. So even though they're the one abusing, it's very weird.
Sure.
So that was that. And then I did, to kind of answer another part of your question, I didn't tell anyone after 5. So I did tell my babysitter. And it wasn't until after I met Jesus at 15 that I finally told, my other parent what had gone on. But I wasn't believed. And so there was this tenaciousness about me. I think God just knew that I had to tell my story. I was going to die. So I retold the story like 5 times. I practically grabbed them and said, listen to me, it happened. I can tell you every place that it happened. And finally they believed me. But it didn't mean I got any help. It just meant I was believed. And then I started the very long slog of healing from all of that. And it's been, the rest of my life has been that journey.
And these are your parents that you told?
Yeah, I didn't tell my biological father because obviously he took his life when I was 10, so I didn't.
So
tell him. And he was also one of my abusers. So that wasn't going to work. But I did tell my mom when I was 15.
right.
So 10 years later.
Wow. That's amazing. Yeah, I never had the chance to tell my father when he died. And my thought was, if I do tell him, he was on his deathbed, dying from third stage cancer, the blood infectious disease. I forgot the name of it. But my thought was, well, if I do tell him this, what is that going to do? What is he going to do with that information? And then what if the bigger fear was, if he rejects me, how am I going to take that information? And I, with the help of my therapist, it was like a no, it's okay not to. My mom, I did tell, but it was a typical response, as like it was when I was younger, more like, oh, well, I'm sorry. And that was it. It was just a very gloss over, like, I want to hear the words, but yet I don't want to get into your world because that's too messy and I can't handle that, which is another form of abuse, honestly.
Yeah, that's neglect. Yep.
Because you're betraying, right?
Mm-hmm.
What was it like for you when you came to Jesus? How did that intersect with, because so many people struggle with the already when they're abused, if it's church or if it's sexual, physical, whatever, the first thought is, I'm unworthy and I'm trashy, I'm ugly. Why would anybody want to accept me or love me? Like what you had said, I don't feel safe from anybody. I feel like trash. Why would God love me? What broke through for you at that moment?
By that time, I had had 3 fathers, and and one was dead, and there was another man in the picture, so 4. And so when I came to the Lord, I heard the gospel at 15 at a weekend Young Life camp. It wasn't so much I was thinking, how could someone love me because I'm so trashy? It was the opposite of that. Was I need a dad that won't leave me. And I was this desperate girl who needed a dad and who'd had all these weird in and out fathers. And so I didn't deal with that at the time. Of course, that came. And I didn't come to the Lord out of this feeling of my sinfulness, though that would come too. It was more of this desperate, desperate need of something solid in my life that was not going to leave me. And so that was just to answer honestly, that's kind of where I was at that time.
Which is so hard to do. I share that because when I was 5 and my abuse happened when I was 6, I knew that there was a God. I didn't grow up in a Christian family. My dad said that he was baptized, but everybody has their own excuse. My mom converted from Catholicism to Christian, but yet it was never really hammered into me. So I kind of lived as an only child. My parents divorced. My brother and sister departed from the house. I was left alone. And I knew that there was a God who loved me. And I remember looking at each of my family members saying, I do not want to end up like that. Because all of them were shattered or broken by their own abuse that was happening.
Yeah.
And it's so easy for us to go through life where we become like, how do I say this? We become intentionally or unintentionally blinded by our abuse. Why is it so hard, do you think, for survivors like yourself and others to agree that you've been abused?
Well, I mean, I think it's embarrassing on a very superficial level. But then there's this fear of they're going to know how broken I am. And then there's also the idea of this veil of secrecy that has been cultivated by those who have abused us. So you have this fear that if you let the secret out, something horrible is going to happen to you. I definitely felt that way as a 5-year-old, and I was a pretty logical little 5-year-old, and I still felt like it was a risk to tell the babysitter. And of course, she dropped the ball, and I kept being abused. But and it's shameful. I mean, because it involves sex, and so there's this a hard thing to talk about, especially like with ideas of purity culture. I mean, I can't tell you how hard it is. A couple things that are hard for me. One was in the 90s, I was already married and all of that. So I kind of skipped the purity culture thing. But there were times in youth group after I became a Christian where they would have those kind of conversations, and my head would go immediately to, I'm already soiled. Is there a do-over? Like, I didn't even want that. I did not, this was not a participatory event. And then the other thing that I struggled with as a married wife was I actually ended up writing a post about this for Christianity Today, and it went viral. But I went to this like Sexy Wives conference where they were telling like a group of 600, 700 women how you had to do all of these things for your husband, for him to really like you, and he needed it. And I almost left, and I almost stood up and said something. That's the rebel in me again, because I looked around the room and I thought, I wonder if I could have people stand up and say, and honestly say, this is exceptionally impossible for me.
Wow.
And
that's awesome.
I didn't have the, it was a formal event and everything, but I did write about it later because I was so upset by the blindness of the women teachers who had literally no idea what 60, 50, whatever percentage of us were going through, and just desperately re-injuring ourselves because we're trying to fit some sort of evangelical idea about what is a hot wife or whatever.
and giving you permission to further be re-abused and not to speak about it.
Yes.
How Christian is that?
Not, but it was all flanked with really great Christian language, which is the problem that we go through in terms of spiritual abuse as well. Like, it's all couched in this Christian language that makes it sound Christian, but it has nothing to do with Jesus. And that's one of the things that I've asked people as I've talked about churches and sexual abuse and systems. I'll say something like, what I do is I ask myself, would Jesus treat a victim this way? And when you ask that question, it's such a boring question and simple, but he would not dismiss. He would not ask questions about what they were wearing. He would not, defend the person who harmed. None of these things are true. He would, and look at how he dealt with Pharisees. When he saw people abusing others, he was pointed and truthful. And so why do we think he wouldn't be in our church systems? Well, it's very weird to me.
Because the typical response would be from the patriarchy answer would be, well, because God had chosen those broken people to show the works of God.
Yeah,
that human all of a sudden. They're,
that's the Gothard way, right?
Right.
Did you watch that on the Shiny Happy People?
Oh,
that's one of his teachings.
I
was
threw up 3 times.
It was really hard to watch.
Oh gosh. So why? Let's talk about shame. Why are survivors often shamed? And why does that keep them from telling their story? And last part is, how can they unlock that shame to begin to speak the words?
So what I've seen in my life with the Lord has been that a relational wound requires a relational cure, which seems really unfair to me, because if you've been wounded in negative relationship, the last thing you want to do is open yourself up to further relationship and further harm. That being said, it's not wise to go and tell your story to anybody. You have to be careful, and you have to learn what it is to be a safe person. You need to know what those traits are. Absolutely. So what I tell people is an untold story never heals. And so if you want to heal, there is a risk. You have to risk, but don't do it quickly. Although a lot of people have waited 30 years. So then that's very slow, but all in God's timing. I'm not saying there's one that's better than the other, but one of the things that I do to advise people is, if they haven't told it yet, at least write it down and put it on a piece of paper somewhere. At least get it out of you, because when it's inside of you, it has this ability to fester and shame and harm you. so much. And those voices in your head, those crazy voices that say you're never going to amount to anything and you're dirty and all those things, they become amplified because there's no one else to take them. We are to bear one another's burdens, but we are depriving others of the privilege of bearing our burdens when we keep it to ourselves, and we're also poisoning ourselves. Wow. So if you write it down, that's the first step, and you're going to feel a lot better once it's out. Then I would pray or seek or watch people, be a stalker, and look for safe traits of people. And then when you feel finally a level of safety, just push that piece of paper across to your friend. You don't even have to say it out loud. Let them read it. And if indeed they are safe, which if you've done your homework, they most likely will be empathetic. Then you have one other person that's bearing the burden. And what I have found that is once you've told one, then the floodgates come and you begin to share your story, not only for your own sake, but for the sake of letting other people know that they're not alone.
I love that. What's your encouragement? How would you help people talk about the beauty of staying in the present? Because as you know, trauma is what tries to harbor us to stay in the past. And the connection thing between thought and feeling is disassociated, which keeps us in our pain. And that's why it's so hard for us to move into the present. So can you talk a little bit about that? And what has that meant for you?
First, I would say it's very normal to be traumatized by a traumatic past. So don't feel bad if you find yourself triggering backwards. That's just an indication that you need more therapy. You need more tenderness toward yourself, some kind-hearted practices, more community of people who love you and walk you through that. So I don't want to say that, that's all bad. It's just normal. It's part of the process. I've recently learned of something called glimmers. You may have talked about this before. A trigger is something that brings you back to something really bad. A glimmer is like this beautiful thing that happens of where you can recall some good things that have happened. And that's one of the things that I learned as in my healing journey is I never had I didn't have one positive memory of my past, not one. Yeah. And literally not one. I could not, someone would ask me, I have no idea. But as I continue to heal, those little glimmers of, there were some good things that happened. Yeah, they come back to you, but they were too blocked by all the grief and trauma. Sure. I couldn't see it. It was just, this was this big ball that covered everything. It was like the thing that chased Indiana Jones. Like that had to get out of the way for me to be able to look around and see what was going on.
So true. Yeah, I share that deeply of having my own block. And you're so right. When you move through therapy and those glimmers come back, and it's almost like you're getting back in touch with yourself and the way that God intended you to be. And you begin to see the great things that really were all around you at the whole time. But we had that trauma that monster that we had to face daily. How does somebody begin to move through that and they don't have the courage to tell their story? What may be some of their concerns, but how does it help them? How does this help free people, free survivors?
I just don't know how you're going to heal without telling your story, just to be super honest. You have to tell it to somebody. And if it means a paid counselor, then so be it. They're paid to be safe. So find a way to do it because it will fester. It will be the wound that affects everything. And what I have found is that I was very adept at stuffing that for a really long time. And there was even a moment in my 20s after I had gone through a whole bunch of healing, I kind of went like this. So I was like, okay, I'm done. Wipe my hands of it. Right. Shoved it way down deep. But here's what happens. And this may be helpful for someone out there. I shoved it down deep. I pretended it hadn't existed for a decade, but it kept popping up in my actions. And then I would look at myself in the mirror and think, why am I acting the very way I vowed I would not? It's because I still have a wound that hasn't been cured. And I can't, it's like the beach ball. You can push it down successfully for a long time, but eventually you tire of that and it pops back up. It pops back up in your behavior. And the only way to keep it down is to deflate it by letting out your story.
Well, what do you say to the myth that's so present out there that says, yeah, well, all you need is Jesus. You don't need a therapist. You don't need to go to professional counseling. You just need church and the Bible and Jesus to fix you. And he's done that with me, and he's healed me, and I no longer think about those things anymore. What do you say to that, Mary? Be honest and colorful. It's okay. You can swear if you want to.
Honestly, a lot of it for me was Jesus. So I'm not going to throw Jesus out with the bathwater.
Right.
There has been so much internal healing that has happened through the body of Christ and through Jesus. But a lot of people in the body of Christ, unfortunately, are not trauma informed. They don't understand the nature of trauma. Even my husband didn't understand the nature of trauma. And he finally read a book, which, I was so grateful that he did. And I didn't suggest it to him. He just picked it up and he looked at me and he apologized.
What book was
because it was the, what's that guy? Dan Allender's book.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
The Wounded Heart.
Oh my gosh. That's awesome.
Yeah. So he read that book and then he apologized because he wasn't trauma informed either. And I was going crazy because I kept thinking, well, this is just behavior modification. Like, why can't I just force myself to love my husband that way? Why can't I just, is something that there's a fault in me, not realizing that it was a trauma trigger over and over and over again. And now, this was several years ago, but once he understood that, it became, and I had more autonomy, it became better. But again, we need people in our lives who are trauma informed. They could be Christ followers. They may not be Christ followers, but I have needed to go to do some of that kind of like EMDR and some of those other therapies, talk therapy, because I didn't understand the nature of trauma. Also, books like The Body Keeps the Score, super important, really helpful I was having all these problems and I was like, what is wrong with me?
Yeah, that's right.
And then I read that book and I was like, okay, now I get it.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
That's so great.
And I mean, just one more thing. We just didn't have a lot of money as a married couple. I mean, we were missionaries in France. We were just we were single income. And so I did not have the luxury of counseling. And it was only until he went to seminary that they allowed spouses to get free counseling with like the people going through the counseling programs, not even full counselors. But that was the first time I was able to do it. And it's still kind of expensive for us. So I read a lot of books and you can learn a lot from things like The Body Keeps the Score. So if you're stressed out financially, there are ways that or joining a support group online or something like that. There are free-ish things you can do to help yourself.
Love it. Real quick, in the time that we have left, you've written some amazing books. One that you had already mentioned, Love, Pray, Listen, Parenting Your Wayward Adult, all the way to The Most Misunderstood Woman, and the 90-Day Bible Reading Challenge. That's something that you just released. Can you tell us a little bit about that and where people can find it?
Yeah, that just released, and I help people read the Bible in a very short period of time. And there's just all sorts of amazing spiritual benefits to that. So if people want to join me, I'm starting in January, then go to marydemuth.com/Bible. And then another book that I've read that's kind of relevant, the couple of books that I read that I wrote relevant to this discussion is We Too, How the Church Can Respond Redemptively to the Sexual Abuse Crisis, Not Marked, Finding Hope and Healing After Sexual Abuse, and then my memoir, Thin Places. All those three deal with recovery from sexual abuse. And I also have a free 21-day email sequence about healing from sexual abuse, absolutely free. They can go to we2.org/21 days.
Wow, that's awesome. Mary, it's just been phenomenal, just exhilarating, if you will, just to hear your story, the way that God moved through you to begin your walk of that recovery process. And we're blessed to hear what you have to say, but to look into your world a little bit that will help us give hope, as it gives us hope, those glimmers that you talked about and how to keep moving forward. So what would you like to say to the rest of our listeners and watchers?
I guess I would say I want to give you a hug in an appropriate way. And it is normal to struggle, and it is normal to ask questions, and it is normal to feel like you'll never get through this. But the truth is, even though it is slow, healing can happen. It is happening under the surface, much like the wintertime. You can't see anything happening, and then suddenly spring comes. There's a friend of mine who, a friend of a friend who said this phraseology that has really helped me. And she said, sometimes it takes God a long time to do something suddenly. So stay the course, persevere. He sees you. He will take you along this journey.
Wow. Fantastic. Well, Mary, I'd love to have you back, as I said before, and as your schedule permits. And so, again, thank you for being with us. Where can people find you?
Yeah, I'm at Mary DeMuth on the social platforms, and then marydemuth.com. You can find everything there.
Okay, fantastic. Mary, thanks so much again for joining us today, and we look forward to having you back. And everybody else, remember, your story matters, and it is worth confessing. See you next time here soon.
Thanks for joining us today on Your Story Matter podcast with Branon Dempsey. Did you know that when you rate and comment on this podcast, you are not only helping us spread the word about Your Story Matters, but you are letting people know that their story matters too? Please kindly rate and comment on today's podcast. This has been a Your Story Matters digital production. Copyright 2024. Hope you were inspired from today's episode as you grow in your recovery from trauma, because your story matters.